The report I filed on the Kettleman Draw crossing runs to 41 pages in the system, and none of them say what I am about to write here. I know the difference between an incident report and the truth. I have written enough of the former to know when I am avoiding the latter. My name is on the certification stamp for signal systems across the western half of the division, which means that for 11 years, my job has been to trust instruments. That is the whole discipline, really. A grade crossing is a machine that has to make a life and death decision several thousand times a year with no human in the loop. And my work is to verify that the decision it makes is correct. When a crossing activates, a train is coming. When it clears, the track is empty. Everything else in the system, the gates, the bells, the flashers, the timing, is downstream of that one binary fact. I have spent my career proving that the fact is reliable. Instruments do not lie. That is not a sentimental claim. It is the foundation of the entire safety architecture. And if it were not true, people would die at rates the public would not tolerate. I want that understood before I describe what happened at Kettleman Draw, because otherwise it will sound like I stopped trusting instruments. I did not. The problem is that I never stopped. The assignment came to me the ordinary way, as a maintenance audit triggered by a false activation complaint. Crossing 114-J, milepost 297.6 on the Bristow subdivision, a spur line that carries maybe one unit train of aggregate a week and otherwise sits quiet. Kettleman Draw is not a town, it is a name on a survey from 1911. A shallow dry wash where the line crosses a county-grade road that sees perhaps a dozen vehicles a day, most of them ranch trucks. There is a cattle guard, a stop sign, a set of gates, mast-mounted flashers, and a bungalow housing the crossing controller. Nothing else for 8 miles in either direction. The complaint file was thin and I assumed routine. A county road maintenance supervisor had logged 3 calls over 4 months reporting that the gates at 114-J had come down and the lights had activated with no train present. False activations are common and almost always explainable. Shunt failures, ballast contamination, a corroded bond wire, moisture in a case, a track circuit drifting out of adjustment. They are the bread and butter of what I do. A crossing that cries wolf is a liability because eventually drivers learn to ignore the gates and then a real train kills someone. So we take the complaints seriously and we run them down. I expected to spend a day at Kettleman Draw, find a bad bond or a wet relay, write it up, and drive home. I pulled the event recorder logs before I made the trip, which is standard. Every modern crossing has a solid-state event recorder that captures the state of every input and output on a millisecond timescale. Track circuit occupancy, gate position, lamp voltage, bell status, prime power, battery voltage, the works. If a crossing false activates, the recorder tells you why, because it shows you exactly which circuit changed state to trigger the sequence. A false activation from a shunt failure looks different from one caused by a power transient, which looks different from one caused by an actual train. You learn to read them the way a doctor reads an EKG. I opened the logs for the 3 complaint dates and found the answer immediately, which is when the day stopped being routine. None of the 3 activations were false. Each one showed a complete textbook train movement. The approach circuit dropped, meaning something entered the detection zone from the west. Then, at exactly the right interval for a train moving at track speed, the island circuit dropped, the short circuit directly over the crossing. Then the departure circuit dropped as the movement cleared to the east. The gates lowered on the correct timing after warning. The occupancy time was consistent with a train of a specific length moving at a specific speed. The axle counter, an independent system that does nothing but count wheel sets across a point, registered a coherent axle sequence. A head-end locomotive consists in a string of loaded cars. Every input agreed with every other input. The signature was not the ragged, contradictory mess of a malfunction. It was clean. It was a train. I remember sitting at my desk thinking the complaint was simply wrong. The county supervisor had seen the gates down and assumed no train because he didn't see one. But the crossing had done exactly what it was supposed to do. That happens. People miss trains. A movement can clear before you look up. So the anomaly at that point was not the crossing. It was the human witness, and human witnesses are the least reliable element in any investigation. I nearly closed the file. What kept me from closing it was a habit rather than a suspicion. Whenever I confirm a real movement, I cross-check it against the dispatch record, because every train that occupies main or spur track does so under authority. A train does not simply appear on the railroad. Someone assigns it a symbol, a crew, a locomotive, and a track warrant or a signal indication authorizing it into that block. That authority is logged in the dispatch system, and the locomotives themselves report GPS position every few seconds to the Network Operations Center. If the crossing recorded 3 trains, there were 3 trains, and I could tell you their symbols, their crews, and where they are now. There were no trains. For each of the 3 complaint dates, the dispatch log for the Bristow subdivision showed no movement authorized anywhere near milepost 297.6, no track warrant, no occupancy, no crew on duty for that territory. The locomotive GPS feed, which covers every powered unit on the property, showed nothing within 30 miles of the crossing at the recorded times. There were no crew reports, no delay reports, no radio traffic. According to every system that governs the operation of the railroad, the track at Kettleman Draw was empty at the moments the crossing recorded a train passing over it. I have to be precise about what that means, because the strangeness of it is easy to soften. It is not that a train ran without authority. An unauthorized movement is a serious event, but it is a human failure, and it leaves a train somewhere. A rogue movement still shows up on locomotive GPS. It still has a crew who has to explain themselves. It still gets seen at the next crossing. What I was looking at was a train that had been detected by physical instrumentation. Track circuits are analog devices that work by measuring the electrical resistance across the rails. And a train shorts that resistance because steel wheels on steel rail form a conductive path, but that had left no trace in any system that tracks the existence of trains. The obvious explanation was that the crossing was malfunctioning in a way sophisticated enough to mimic a train. I did not believe it, because a shunt failure does not produce a coherent axle count on an independent counter, and it does not sequence 3 separate track circuits in the correct spatial order with the correct timing. But I don't believe it is not an engineering conclusion. So I did what the job requires. I went to verify the equipment. The drive out to Kettleman Draw is 90 minutes of 2-lane asphalt and then 20 of gravel. The crossing sits exactly as forgettable as its file suggests. 2 gates, 2 masts, a controller bungalow the size of a garden shed, and the desert going flat and pale in every direction. I ran the full battery of tests. I measured track circuit calibration on all 3 circuits and found them within tolerance. I checked ballast resistance, bond wire continuity, insulated joint integrity, and battery health. I tested the vital relays. I inspected the axle counter heads and their wheel sensors. I ran a signal relay test and an electrical continuity check on every vital circuit in the case. I checked the calibration certificate on the event recorder itself. Everything passed. Not marginally, cleanly. The equipment at Kettleman Draw was in better condition than most crossings I audit. The bond wires were newer than the equipment they served. The relays had been tested more recently than the schedule required. The ballast resistance was excellent, which for a crossing that age is unusual because ballast degrades and fouls over decades and drives resistance down. This ballast was clean. It had been maintained. I want to note here what I felt, because it was not fear yet. It was the specific professional discomfort of a machine that is working too well. A crossing that malfunctions is a problem you can solve. A crossing that has been recording impossible trains for I did not yet know how long and is in immaculate condition is a different kind of problem because someone has been taking care of it, and you do not take care of a machine you think is broken. You replace it or you fix the defect. You do not lovingly maintain a liar. Standing in that bungalow, I made the decision that turned a one-day audit into the thing I am writing about now. I pulled the full event recorder history. Modern recorders hold years of data locally and archive to the central system indefinitely. I queried every activation the crossing had ever logged, going back to the installation of the current controller, and then I requested the archived data from the two controllers that had preceded it. Because the archive predates the equipment, the infrastructure is replaced, the record is continuous. The record went back 38 years. In 38 years, crossing 114-J at Kettleman Draw had logged 4,319 train movements. The Bristow subdivision, in those same 38 years, had carried by the dispatch record, which is authoritative and which I cross-checked exhaustively, approximately 1,100 trains. One unit train of aggregate most weeks, some weeks none, occasional maintenance of way equipment, 1,100 authorized, logged, crewed, GPS-tracked movements. The gap was not a rounding error. The crossing had recorded roughly 3,200 trains that the railroad had no record of dispatching, crewing, powering, or authorizing. More than 3/4 of every activation in the history of that crossing corresponded to a train that officially never existed. And here is the detail that I keep returning to, the one that moved this out of the category of malfunction permanently in my mind. I sorted the unexplained activations and analyzed their operational characteristics, expecting scatter, the randomness of noise. Malfunctions are noisy. They vary. What I found instead was consistency. The unexplained movements were not random at all. They clustered around a small number of distinct, repeating profiles. One profile appeared over and over: an approach speed of 42 miles per hour, an axle count of 406, an occupancy time corresponding to a train of a particular length, always westbound. Another profile, eastbound, appeared nearly as often: a shorter consist, faster, a light locomotive move. A third, rarer, was very long and very slow, the signature of a heavy drag. The railroad ran the same phantom trains on the same schedule characteristics for 38 years. You do not get repeating, coherent, physically consistent operational signatures out of a broken circuit. You get them out of trains. I built the timeline, and the timeline is what I still cannot explain and will not pretend to. The unexplained movements were not evenly distributed. They followed a schedule. The 42-mile-per-hour westbound appeared on average every 11 days, with remarkable regularity, drifting only slightly across the decades the way a real schedule drifts as operating plans change. There were seasonal patterns. There were long gaps that corresponded, when I checked, to periods when the actual Bristow subdivision was out of service for washouts or track work, as though whatever was being detected respected the physical condition of the railroad, even though the railroad had no idea it was there. At this point, I did what the procedure demands and what my own unease demanded, which was to stop working the case as a single system anomaly. One instrument can be wrong. The terrifying thing about instrumentation is not when a single device malfunctions. It is when independent devices, built by different manufacturers running on different principles, with no shared failure mode, all agree. Track circuits work on electrical resistance. Axle counters work on inductive wheel sensors. They cannot lie to each other. If they agree the thing they agree on is real, or the failure is so deep it defeats the entire premise of the safety system. So I went looking for a third independent witness and a fourth. The crossing had a camera. It had been installed 8 years earlier as part of a program to capture grade crossing incidents for liability defense. It records continuously and retains footage for 90 days on a loop. I could not review 38 years of video, but I could do something better. I could wait for the next scheduled phantom. Based on my timeline, the 11-day westbound was due within the week. I set an alert on the crossing's event recorder to notify me the instant the approach circuit dropped, and I pulled the camera into a live monitoring session, and I went home and I waited. Before I get to what the camera showed, I need to record the maintenance history, because I reviewed it while I waited, and it is the part that changed the case from a technical mystery into something I am reluctant to name. I pulled every maintenance work order, contractor note, and inspection report for crossing 114-J for as far back as the records go. What I found was a pattern of inspections that made no procedural sense until I laid it against the activation timeline. The crossing was inspected far more often than its traffic volume warranted. A low-traffic spur crossing rates a periodic inspection on a routine cycle, but Kettleman Draw was being inspected dozens of times a year, and the inspections were not scheduled evenly. They clustered. When I aligned them against the phantom activations, the alignment was exact. Within a day or two of every unexplained movement, a signal maintainer had visited the crossing and performed an inspection. The work orders themselves were unremarkable, which was the strangest part. They did not say investigate false activation. They did not reference the anomaly at all. They read like routine post-service inspections, the kind you perform after a heavy train has passed a check for wear. Inspected crossing following movement, gate operation normal. Checked and tightened gate hardware. Inspected road crossing surface, minor wear noted, within limits. Bond wires intact. No defects. Over and over, for decades, in the hands of a dozen different maintainers, the same quiet notation, inspected following movement, wear noted within limits. Wear. They were finding physical wear. After trains that did not exist, the infrastructure showed fresh mechanical wear consistent with a train having passed. Flange wear on the rail, gate hardware loosened by vibration, surface abrasion on the crossing planks, and the maintainers were tightening the bolts and filling the reports, and never once, in 38 years of documentation, writing down the obvious question. Because they were not treating it as a question. They were treating it as maintenance. Something ran. You inspect afterward. You fix the wear. You file it clean. That is the whole loop, and they had been running it calmly, professionally, for longer than I had been alive. I called the district's senior signal maintainer, a man named Delgado who had worked the Bristow subdivision for 26 years and was 2 years from retirement. I did not lead with the anomaly. I asked him general questions about the territory and let him talk, and eventually I asked, as neutrally as I could, whether 114-J at Kettleman Draw had a history of false activations. I have replayed his answer many times. He did not hesitate and he did not sound troubled. He said, Kettleman's not false. Kettleman's just busy. I asked what he meant. He said the crossing runs more than the timetable shows, always has, and that you inspect after it runs because it runs heavy and it'll shake the gate hardware loose if you let it go. I asked him what trains he meant, since the dispatch records showed the line nearly empty. There was a pause, not a frightened pause, more the pause of a man deciding how much of the obvious he needs to spell out to someone who should already know. He said, you audit the crossing, you know it activates, you've seen the counts. I said yes. He said, then you know it's carrying traffic. I don't dispatch it and I don't ask about it. I keep the crossing safe for the road. That's the job. And then he said the thing I wrote down verbatim, because it is the clearest statement of the whole matter I ever got from anyone. The gates come down for a reason. My job isn't to argue with the reason. My job is to make sure that when they come down, the road's protected. Somebody a long time before me decided the same thing. That's why the crossing's in the shape it's in. He was not describing a haunting. He was describing a maintenance philosophy. The infrastructure detects traffic. You protect the public from the traffic. You maintain the infrastructure that does the detecting. You do not editorialize. It is, if you strip away what the traffic is, completely sound railroad practice. That is what I could not get past. Everyone involved had behaved correctly. The systems worked. The maintainers did their jobs. The safety of the traveling public was, throughout, preserved. The gates came down for the phantom trains, and because they came down, no one at that crossing was ever hurt by a train that the railroad insists was never there. I took the matter up the chain because that is also the job. I wrote a preliminary finding, carefully worded, no speculation, just the numbers. Recorded movements versus authorized movements, the consistency of the profiles, the independent system agreement, the maintenance correlation. I recommended a formal engineering investigation. The response I got back was the second thing that frightened me, in a different register than the data had. The response was not disbelief. I had expected disbelief. I had prepared for it. Instead, my finding was reclassified. The event recorder discrepancy at 114-J was recategorized administratively as a legacy detection variance, assigned a standing exception code, and closed. The exception code, I learned when I looked it up, was not new. It had existed in the system for decades. There is a category buried in the classification schema for crossings whose recorded activity exceeds their authorized activity by a persistent margin. It has a code. It has a defined handling procedure. Continue routine post-activation inspection. No further investigation required. Maintain to standard. The railroad had a form for this. It had had a form for this for a very long time. My finding did not surprise the institution. It was expected. It was filed. I was told politely by a manager I respect that the matter was well understood at the level appropriate to it, that Kettleman Draw was maintained to the highest standard for exactly this reason, that the public was protected, and that there was no operational or safety deficiency to remediate, which, and I want to be fair, is technically correct. There is no safety deficiency. The crossing does its job. He suggested, without threatening anything, that continuing to expend audit hours on a closed legacy classification would not reflect well on my judgment, and that some parts of the network's history are best maintained rather than excavated. He was not unkind. He seemed, if anything, to be trying to spare me something. I went back out to Kettleman Draw for the westbound. I know how that reads. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for a spectacle. I went because I am a signal investigator, and the entire premise of my profession is that instruments do not lie. And I had reached a point where either that premise was false or a train I could not account for was going to cross that road in the desert. And I needed to know which. I set up in my truck 100 yards from the crossing on the county grade, with a clear sight line down the tangent track to the west for over a mile. I had the live event recorder feed on my laptop, the camera feed on my phone, a radio scanner on the road channel and the dispatch channel, and my own eyes. 5 independent witnesses, counting me. It was late afternoon, clear, the light long and flat, visibility unlimited. I could see the rails run straight to the horizon. The approach circuit dropped at 4:47 and 11 seconds. My laptop chimed the alert. On the screen, in real time, I watched the crossing begin its sequence. Warning time started, the bells began, and through my open window I heard them. The actual bells at the actual crossing, and then the flashers lit, and the gates began their descent, and the mechanical arms came down across the empty road exactly as designed. The event recorder showed the approach circuit occupied, a train in the block, closing at 42 miles per hour. I looked down the track. There was no train. The rails ran straight and empty to the horizon in the clear late light, and there was nothing on them and nothing approaching them, and no sound of a locomotive and no headlight and no smoke and no disturbance of the air. Nothing. I checked the camera feed on my phone. The camera, pointed straight down the track, showed the same empty rails I saw with my own eyes. The two visual witnesses agreed. No train. And every other system disagreed with them. The island circuit dropped on schedule. Something was now directly over the crossing, in the 12 feet of track between the gates, the most heavily instrumented spot in the entire system, 40 feet from where I sat. The axle counter began to increment. I watched the count climb on my laptop in real time, wheel set after wheel set, registering across a point I was staring directly at. And there was nothing there. 406 axles. It took at 42 miles per hour, the exact occupancy time a real train of that length would take. The gates stayed down. The road stayed protected. And then the departure circuit dropped and the island cleared and the count finished and the gates rose and the bells stopped and the crossing returned to normal and the recorder logged a complete, clean, textbook westbound freight movement across a road in front of a man who was watching the empty track with his own eyes the entire time. I have thought a great deal about which fact frightened me. It was not the empty rails. I could tell myself a story about the empty rails, a sensor fault, a cascade of correlated failures, some exotic malfunction I hadn't imagined. The thing I cannot tell a story about is that the ground shook. When the island was occupied, when the count was climbing, I felt through the frame of my truck, through the ground, the low sustained vibration of a heavy train passing close. It is a sensation I know in my body from 20 years around trains. It was not loud. There was no horn, no roar, no wheels on rail. Just the deep, ground-born tremor of great mass in motion over steel, and the faint sway of my truck on its springs, for exactly the occupancy time, and then stillness. Whatever the instruments were recording, it was not confined to the instruments. It had weight. The rails carried it. The axle counter counted its wheels. The earth transmitted its passage, and the light and the air and the camera lens registered nothing at all. I did not get out of the truck. I want to be honest about that, too. There was a moment during the island occupancy when the professional impulse to go and put my hand on the rail, to stand at the crossing and confront directly the thing the instruments insisted was there, rose in me, and I did not act on it because I understood, in a way I could not have argued for, that the 12 feet of instrumented track between those gates was occupied. Every certified system on the property that exists to answer the question, is the track occupied, was answering yes. I have spent my life trusting those systems. I was not going to stop trusting them at the one moment they might be protecting me. The gates were down. I stayed behind the gates. That is what the gates are for. I drove home that night, and I did not sleep. And in the morning, I understood that Delgado had told me the truth, and that the manager had told me the truth, and that the exception code was the truth. There was nothing to expose. There was no cover-up in the sense that word usually means. There was only an institution that had, at some point beyond the reach of its own records, encountered infrastructure that detected traffic beyond its official network, and had made the sane and responsible decision to protect the public from that traffic rather than to argue about its metaphysics. The railroad is not tracking unknown trains. It has quietly, competently built and maintained a set of procedures around the fact that certain crossings record movements it cannot account for. And it maintains those crossings to a high standard precisely because the movements are real enough to shake gate hardware loose. The safety system does not require you to understand the train. It requires you to protect the road when the train comes. On that measure, Kettleman Draw is one of the best maintained crossings on the division. It has to be. It is busy. I am writing this in the week of the monthly maintenance review, which is the reason I finally sat down to put it all in one place. because of what I found in the review packet this morning. I was not looking for Kettleman draw. I was reviewing the routine work orders for the coming cycle across the division, and it was there in the schedule list. A post-activation inspection for crossing 114-J at milepost 297.6, scheduled for next week. The inspection is scheduled. It has a date, a maintainer assigned, and a work order number. Post-activation inspection, meaning an inspection to be performed after an activation. The activation it is scheduled to follow has not happened yet. I checked the event recorder. The last log movement was the westbound I watched weeks ago. There has been nothing since. The dispatch schedule for the coming week is empty. No train is authorized on the Bristow subdivision. No crew is assigned. No locomotive is anywhere near it. By every system that governs the operation of the railroad, nothing is going to cross that road next week. But the inspection is on the calendar. Someone or something in the scheduling logic that has been running this loop longer than anyone now employed here has been alive, has already scheduled the maintenance that follows the train. The 11-day westbound is due. The system knows it is due. It has planned for the wear. I have not decided whether I will be there when it runs. I keep telling myself there is nothing to see, and that is true. There is nothing to see. I have proven that there is nothing to see. That was never the frightening part. The frightening part is everything that is not seen, and that is confirmed, and that is expected, and that the railroad has already calmly scheduled the work to clean up after. The gates will come down, the road will be protected. A maintainer will drive out afterward and find the gate hardware shaken loose and the rail freshly worn, and he will tighten the bolts and file the report and write, as his predecessors have written for 38 years, inspected following movement, wear within limits, no defects. And he will be right. There are no defects. Everything is working exactly as it is supposed to. That is the whole horror of it. Nothing here is broken. The instruments do not lie. They never have. I only wish now that they did.